I'm going to read a chapter of a new book which will carry the title, The Terrible Children of Modern Times, a book in which I try to tell the story of modern disinhibitions, or the march into groundless situations. And one chapter in that book is dedicated to the events of Jekaterinburg in the night of the 16th to the 17th of July, 1918. The events of August 1914 marked the start of a century of disinhibitions. The following years demonstrated what progress can trigger if the terrain is skewed. The massive battles of material on all European front lines made it clear what conditions needed to be met if the characteristic mental operation of the age, counting the dead, was to move to the level of 7 or 8 digits. Heidegger's famous theorem in Being and Time, published in 1927, the same year in which this document was produced, according to which authentic existence is gained by running forward into one's own death and returning from that final temporal edge back into the current now, was a precise philosophical reflection accompanying the war-conditioned experience of a radical degradation of life. If read closely, the word existence was meant to signify having stormed into a mass grave. Thanks to an inconceivable coincidence, one had returned from there into what was purportedly once again a civil life. However, once mobilized and then returned, life can never again be civil. Specifically now that the deaths are in the millions, the anonymous individual existence perceives itself more acutely than ever before as an uncommensurable, ontological, exceptional matter of fact. Against the backdrop of total degradation of each individual, it experiences itself as a fathomless, intrinsically vibrant existence as exposures. The Heideggerian term is ausgesetzt sein oder geworfen sein. That is factually given. It is by dint of being as good as nothing, nevertheless, unlike anything else, that is merely factual matter. And henceforth, the old notion of mortality before God morphs into a new existential state. One could also term this a state of also possibly soon being dead in mass graves. This prospect of a possible end soon is what's not yet dead, and that means existence. And existence encounters as an extreme possibility. The only key distinction it can now make is to accept that extreme possibility with resolve, instead of indulging in the distraction that appears to the premortals to be life. In terms of his historical shape and timbre, what Heidegger terms being unto death is the existential position of the person coming home from war. Here, the old European decorum reaches a 0 point in terms of its bellicose, heroic tradition. It reveals that being unto mass grave is the last phase of Occidental heroism. And one has to admit that a long and winding but continuous path leads from Achilles to the tomb of the unknown soldier. At the same time, the talk of being unto death expresses the feeling that the mobilization until death never ceases to agitate the individuals. The impossibility of demobilization informs the existential sentiment of those contemporaries who have completely ingested the World War as an event, including those who immersed themselves in post-war entertainment. Because for many of the combatants, the mobilization for the war of all wars proves to be irreversible. Existence going forward will prove to be so sliding from one war to the next. This is especially true among those who, like the Marxists, decisionists and political Darwinists, wish to believe at the ideological level too that we live in a state of permanent struggle, battle and animosity. The syndrome that emerged immediately after World War I and went by the name of fascism, starting with Mussolini's left nationalist movement, the parading black shirts of his paramilitary movement, functioned on occasion effectively at once in political, military and cultural formations. Following 1917 and 1918, the latter felt, demanded and practiced the transition from one war into the next war, in the Freikorps, in the Civil War leagues, in the stormtrooper sections of the parliamentary parties, in the revolutionary cadres, and in one or another segment of an agitated art. The fascist impulse, as a will to go on fighting after the war of all wars, is to be found in many places, including in some where it does not call itself such, not least among those who loudly declare they have nothing to do with this, and to be the opposite of it. Fascism is agreement to the impossibility of demobilization. It manifests itself in the unmistakably stated will to remain at arms and on the attack, and why not then on different front lines and with new enemies. This is why we cannot consider fascism to be a mere party or a mere ideology. In terms of its fundamental gestures, it has traits of a militant league, arising in the spirit of a refusal to demobilize. It is a will to exist in a march that forever goes forward. Mussolini terms this quite clearly as the horror of a comfortable life. It is a sentiment that gels in the conviction that the word post-war era is nothing more than the combination of meaningless syllables. It is based in the belief, epidemic on both the left and the right after 1917 and 1918, that a war without an after had begun. Indeed, had always, perhaps always been waged, a war that one could not escape being drafted into, not than one wished to duck the opportunity. In the language of cultural theory, the continuation of the mode of war in existence after it could be termed as transfer of habits, a term coined by Pierre Bourdieu. Military patterns continued to define those who had long been soldiered, be it drafted in or as volunteers for service, after their reconversions to civilian life. World War I had lasted long enough to instill a few deeply effective schema in its combatants on the physical and mental front lines, with consequences that intervened in their mental behavior after the end of direct acts of war. Without doubt, Lenin was one of those who most stimulated all the movements that sought to transpose the World War into a follow-up war. The author of the treatise What is to be Done of 1902 had waited for 15 seemingly endless years in exile for an opportunity to return to Russia. When, with the assistance of the German High Command, he and 30 companions in arms traveled from Switzerland to Finland in April 1917, and he stayed in hiding there until October, waiting for the cue to go on the attack. He found conditions that contained all the seeds for transferring one war into the next. He had penned the theoretical premises for these next steps during the summer months in a Finnish cabin. Since the state had thus far, in the eyes of the Marxist analyst, been nothing other than an instrument to secure economic exploitation and deceitful bridging of irresolvable class differences, the old apparatus could not simply be taken over by the revolutionaries, the way the Social Democrats and other opportunists preached. Instead, it had to be smashed and the shards reassembled in new combinations again and again until socialist conditions had long been last achieved, and finally an arrival in the final destination of communism possible, with the state having withered away in the process. Starting from these premises, the author of What is to be Done cast a sharp eye over conditions in Russia in the final years of the imperialist war. In actual fact, activists of the Russian February Revolution had deposed the Tsarist regime 6 months before Lenin's return and had forced Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate. In March, a provisional democratic government led by the non-party politician Georgy Count Lov had been inaugurated, supported by a coalition of the bourgeoisie and social revolutionaries. Among the latter was Alexander Kerensky, first as Minister of Justice, then as Minister of War, and finally as Prime Minister of the Republic of Russia, which he himself proclaimed the 14th September 1917. What Lenin found on his return was a revolutionized country that was weak enough to be moved at first effortlessly from one revolution forward to the next, and as was to transpire from one war to the next, albeit at coasts that rocketed. Was it not Lenin himself who had, in his recent treatise, written in Finland, had praised the Paris Commune for having transformed a people's war into a civil war? Later raised to a mythical status, the acts of the so-called October Revolution all took place in a no-man's land of absolute illegitimacy. An illegitimacy that the actors proudly claimed to be as if it was a title of honor, which served them as proof of their non-contamination by conditions hitherto that had likewise been completely robbed of any legitimacy. The backdrop against we should view the October events was the historical seizure of power by those who led this coup and who, in the event being successful, wanted to be considered revolutionaries. The actions were dictated by scenarios that Lenin had gleaned from the French revolutions of 1789, 1793, and 1871. They are, in the broadest sense, to be considered scenographical phenomena buttressed by the dramaturgical conviction of the classical left that the patterns of the revolutions in France called for a repeat performance both at the same venue and elsewhere. Russian conditions in autumn 1917 were sufficiently amorphous as to adapt to any phantasm if it were only projected onto them with sufficient energy. The fact that the storm of the Winter Palace, celebrated with due pomp every year afterwards and initiated by the legendary blank shot from one of the guns of the cruiser Aurora, and the abolition of the existing legal government and its replacement by the Bolsheviks, was in truth a pure non-event. That was something that researchers only found out much later, having escaped the glass jar of propaganda. What was referred from the 1920s onwards as the Great Socialist October Revolution never took place, in facto. The mandate to democratize and modernize Russia lay solely with the Duma, which had been part of the government since 1912 and had ruled on its own. That's what happens here. Since September 1917, however weak the legal justifications were. But from Lenin's point of view of analogical historic thinking, the February Revolution was nothing other than a counterpart of the bourgeois revolution of 1789, forever despised by the radicals. He was determined to move immediately to the serious phase of 1793 without repeating the mistakes of the Jacobins, namely that they left the men of the Thermidor too much scope for opposing the dictatorship. I suppose you remember that Thermidor was the name of the month of June in the revolutionary calendar of these times. And in the year 1794, the people of the Thermidor overthrew the dictatorship of Robespierre and his fellows. While for France, the year 1793 spelled the concatenation of outer war and inner rule of terror, for the Russians, 1917 and 1918 signified the end of outer war and the monopolization of inner power by the Bolsheviks. The first goal was achieved by the peace treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the German Reich in March 1918, which covered Lenin's back for his second war, the class war to be waged against the relics of old Russian society. The other goal was enforced by a second sally into the uncertain terrain of illegitimacy. The Bolsheviks had suffered a major defeat in the elections to the Constituent Assembly on November 11th, 1917, garnering only 22% of the votes. And Lenin decided at short notice to use violence to dissolve the Constituent Assembly, which was dominated by the large majority of the social revolutionaries, in Western terms, the leftist social democrats, and had convened on the afternoon of 5th of January in the Tsarist Palace the very next morning. The only attempt to create a form of government legitimated by general elections in Russia thus lasted exactly 13 hours. In the general apathy, this event went as good as unnoticed. For a culture without any experience of democracy and without the structures of a major civil society, the disbandment of the Constituent Assembly simply fitted the general picture of material misery, impotent anger, premature resignation, and depressive fatalism. The path forward only seemed open if one aggravated things. Lenin's despise for the parliamentary mode evolved after 6th January 1918 into the defining ferment of a movement into world history that had an unprecedented character, namely the wish to throw oneself into the future in the form of free fall. The most important instruments that Lenin dreamed up with which to implant enduring policies a la 1793 in Russia post-war reality was the Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage, abbreviated as VCK or simply Cheka. By founding it already in December 1917, a couple of weeks after the so-called revolution, he proved how thoroughly he had studied the lessons taught by the French terror. He had before his eyes the fact that simply having the guillotine in full-time operation had not sufficed back then to buttress the dictatorship of virtue. A revolution would never be secure as long as it permitted the existence of individuals capable of actions as those of the terminator. In this analysis, the danger to his revolution was not so much the product of the deployment of terrorist means and the bourgeoisie's understandable aversion to them, but from the half-hearted use of such tools. Terror would first have fulfilled its historical mission if no one dared any longer resist it. The Cheka was meant to ensure that the courage to reject Bolshevik rule would over the years be deemed an un-Russian characteristic. This country will never see a Thermidor. This is a psychopolitical axiom that makes Lenin's decisions in 1917 and 1918 readily comprehensible. Moreover, with his decree on the Red Terror in September 1918, he laid the foundations for the beginning of the doctrine of corrective labor camps, gulags, in which, under the pretense of political education, the concept of destroying life through labor was to be put onto practice. No one yet imagined what establishing such a counterworld would bring about. In the camps, a second concept of labor arose that exposed the innermost workings of the first. The penal labor world developed into a parody of the archipelago of normal work and gave the term working class a slave-like ring to it, whereas in the official speech that class, working class, was made the basis of all virtues. Lenin's 1793 policies culminated inevitably in a repeat performance of the prosecution and the process of Louis XVI with Russian players instead. In line with the para-Jacobin script, Tsar Nicholas II was to be brought before a people's court or a Bolshevik convention to answer for his crimes against the Russian people. Nicholas the Bloody. Since the sentence was set a priori, the case could meaningfully only be conducted as a short trial, as a measure with an agitational thrust meant to teach people new convictions and therefore impact on the masses. It was meant to offer the greatest opportunity for the revolution to present itself through dramatic propaganda. But soon Lenin started to doubt whether staging a repeat performance of the trial of the former rulers was actually practicable. Firstly, he realized there was a danger that this could increase the Tsar's popularity and thus delegitimize the Bolsheviks' highly unstable power system. And secondly, he did not wish in any way to tolerate assigning the sentimental Russian people the role of a competent judge over its dethroned lord, and be it only in the position of an observer. In his conviction, political judgment in his country was only to be placed in the hands of an elite which had conceived as a proletariat. He deemed dictators. Sociologically speaking, it was a lightweight minority. And indeed, in his eyes, all the other strata, specifically the lower and rural populations, constituted nothing other than an immature, unreliable and reactionary mob to be taken into account solely as a base material for revolutionary re-education. It vouches for Lenin's elasticity in his infallibility that in the months that follows, he simply abandons the idea of a show trial of the Tsar. Also, preparations were already underway to hold it. In particular, Trotsky had been chosen as chief prosecutor. On Kerensky's instruction, the Tsar and his family had been already moved to Tobolsk in Siberia in August 1917, partly for their own protection and partly to ease the atmosphere in St. Petersburg. In April 1918, the order was issued to transfer the Tsar and his retinue to Moscow, Russia's new capital city, and the designed stage for the show trial. It proved difficult to transport the family, above all because the 10-year-old Tsarevich, Alexei, who was an hemophiliac, has suffered a renewed outbreak of the disease, and the Tsar refused to leave him behind. From the 30th April onwards, the imperial family was accommodated in the then insignificant city of Jekaterinburg in the south of Europe, some 1,500 kilometers east of Moscow, in the villa of an engineer named Ipatiev, which had been requisitioned for the purpose. Strict attention was paid to completely isolate the prisoners from the outside world. The windows of the Ipatiev house were painted with white color, as if the Romanov family was to spend its last months behind the opaque glass of disinformation and humiliation. Agents of the local Cheka were entrusted with guarding over the prisoners. In the first few weeks of July, the Council of the People's Commissars, the Sovnarkom, finally resolved in Moscow under Lenin's diktat to drop the trial and to enact the sentence which had long since been decided. What was still to be done was intended to occur no more and no less than at the command of historical necessity, which could countenance no alternative. Only the physical destruction of the Tsar and his family could nip any thought of monarchic restoration in the bud. The ugliness of the scenes that ensued have moved countless people throughout the 20th century. Actually, they become the material of a kind of counter-propaganda in the circles of Russian immigrants. Under the pretense of having to save the family and its retinue from the oncoming White Guards, the Tsar, the Tsarina, their 5 children, the Tsarevich and four daughters, and some servants were taken down into the cellar of the Ipatiev house on the night of the 16th of July, where the leader of the execution squad, Yakov Mikhailovich Yurovsky, first gave various harmless excuses and then told the Tsar that the government had decided and ordered his execution by firing squad. No time was left for the morituri to ask questions. What followed was a massacre that lasted almost 20 minutes, during which countless shots missed their mark even from a short distance, and the executioners, 7 prisoners of war from Hungary, assisted by 4 Bolsheviks, after used their bayonets in particular to kill the 4 seriously wounded girls whose corsets, into which items of the family jewels had been sewn, were hard to pierce. The members of the execution squad evidently trembled that much that you were unable to hit their target, even from a very short distance. But the disposal of the 11 stripped bodies constituted a very unusual chapter in the history of following orders. Yurovsky and his subordinates not only had to follow the instructions from Moscow to the letter, but also felt part of their revolutionary mission was to eliminate all traces of what had happened. They acted in line with the motto that the revolution does not need historians, which Lenin had penned at around the same time in a letter to Gorky. The latter had asked for historian Nikolaus Mikhailovich, one of the grand princes of the empire, to be spared. The grave in the countryside containing the bodies of the executed family was not discovered until 1979, and exhumation was not possible until 1991. As regards what Lenin achieved in terms of the history of morals in this matter, he had informalized the office of hangman and transformed it into an ubiquitous, forever updatable agent of revolutionary violence. In the form of the checker, he established a collective of executioners which diffuse eliminatory powers that could be enlarged and applied at any point. Almost all ceremonial trappings became superfluous by privileging almost informal execution by bullet. The pistol replaced the guillotine, revealing the transfer of the mode of gang wars onto domestic policy. Until the days of the Great Terror, the pistol remains a weapon par excellence in the execution cosmos of the continued war, and a bullet to the head was the preferred method for dispatching representatives of past eras. The paradigm of the non-everyday elimination in Jekaterinburg shows the direction in which Lenin's ideas on the continued war went. Once the Brest-Litovsk Treaty has freed his hands to attack on the inner front lines, he did not hesitate to open the second front, class struggle, of which he thought, as a reader of Marx, that it constituted the real war of wars, indeed the primordial conflict in human history, the campaign against the enemy since time immemorial of the popular masses, the ruling class and its lackeys. Lenin's announcements in the hectic events of 1918 revealed how quickly for him the style of the Second War became clear. From the viewpoint of an armchair dictator, the executions ordered by him were meant to turn into disinfection measures. The liquidation of opponents swiftly equaled the extermination of insects. Lenin's article of the 7th and the 10th January 1918 on purging the Russian earth of all vermin proved to be programmatic treatise. He considered not only the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie, the expressed class enemy, to be vermin. The group also included church-goers, priests, high school teachers, intellectuals, house owners, unmotivated workers, and marginalized members of the populace. And Lenin's appeals, dating from August 1918, used words such as spiders and bloodsuckers to describe the more prosperous farmers, and declared merciless war upon them. Death to the kulaks, hate and despite the parties that defend them. By establishing the Cheka, Lenin unleashed a liquidation apparatus that made the interaction between the Public Welfare Committee and the guillotine in the years of the French Terror seem like an overly ceremonial fuss. No one gives a more precise account of the informalization of the executioners in the Russian Revolution and the inflation thereof during the Stalinist era than does Alexander Solzhenitsyn. The Cheka was the only punitive organization in human history that combined in one set of hands investigation, arrest, interrogation, prosecution, trial, and execution. All of this happens as if the Russian revolutionaries wanted to concur with the Frenchman Lebas, who said during the glorious days of the French Revolution, the bridges behind us are burned. Whether we like it or not, we must go forward. Let me stop here, and we have a short conversation together.